Good evening, everyone, and very good morning to Professor David S. Masson. I'm Prashant Kumar Sharma, an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science, Bidhan Chandra College, affiliated to the University of Calcutta. I, on behalf of the Department of Political Science and Internal Quality Assurance Cell (IQAC) of our institution, warmly welcome you all to this international webinar entitled "The End of American Century." This webinar has been organized by the Department of Political Science in association with the Internal Quality Assurance Cell (IQAC) of our institutions. We have got with us Professor Sanjay K. Bhardwaj, Professor at the Center for South Asian Studies, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and Professor David S. Masson, Professor Emeritus at the Department of Political Science, Butler University, Indianapolis, USA, as the distinguished resource person for this international webinar. For me, it is indeed an honor to introduce them. May I now introduce to our distinguished chair of this international webinar, Professor Sanjay K. Bhardwaj, sir. Professor Sanjay K. Bhardwaj is professor and former chairperson at the Center for South Asian Studies and for former director at Energy Studies program at the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. His area of academic interest includes India's foreign policy, political security, socio-economic and foreign policy issues of South Asian countries. He is recipient of SRT Fellow Awards 2009-2010 at the London School of Economics on contesting identities in Bangladesh, secular and Islamic frontiers. He was also recipient of Asia Fellow Awards 2010-2011, Asia Scholarship Foundation, Bangkok, at the University of Dhaka, Bangladesh on Bangladesh. Sorry for the interruption. He has also been Chinese Academy of Social Science ICSSR Fellow 2013. Beijing in Beijing on China's South Asia policy. He has also been SUSI Fellow 2018 on National Security Policy Making at University of Delaware, USA. He has supervised more than 25 PhD scholars on South Asia so far. So thank you very much for joining with us. Professor David S. Masson is distinguished speaker of our webinar. He is a Professor Emeritus at the Department of Political Science, Butler University, Indianapolis, USA. He holds a BA in Government and Russian from Cornell University, an MA in International Relations from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced and International Studies, and a PhD in Political Science and a certificate in Russian and East European Studies from Indiana University. Professor Masson is the author of 6 books on European and world politics and history, including Revolution in East Central Europe, the rise and fall of communism and the Cold War, and the end of American century. He also coordinated an international collaborative research project, the International Social Justice Project, that involved 13 countries, including 10 European ones. Besides teaching courses on international, European, and Russian politics, he taught and coordinated Butler's core curriculum, Global Studies courses, which included a unit on modern Europe. Professor Masson has received several teaching awards, including Outstanding Teacher in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. So thank you very much for joining with us. We are deeply honored with your presence. May I now request to the head of our institution, Dr.Ramesh, Vice Principal, sir, to kindly deliver a formal welcome address. Sir, now it's over to you.
Thank you. Good evening to everyone. Respected research persons, honorable dignitaries, dear colleagues, research scholars, conveners of the webinars, and HOD of the Department of Political Science, and affectionate students. It is really a great pleasure and privilege to be present in the international webinar organized by the Department of Political Science in association with IPSC Bidhan Chandra College, Rishra, Holi. Being the head of the institute, I must congratulate the students and teachers of the Department of Political Science, especially the HOD, Professor Devdas De, and conveners, Professor Prashant Kumar Sharma, as they have taken initiative to organize the international webinars. First of all, I, on behalf of the Institute, first welcome the respected research person, Professor Sanjay Bhardwaj, Professor Center for South Asian Studies, School of International Studies, JNU, New Delhi, and Professor David Masson, Emeritus Professors, Department of Political Science, Butler University, USA. I would be immensely grateful as they have responded to our invitation despite their busy schedule. I convey my best wishes to our governing body president, Dr.Sudipto, and all governing body members for moral support to organize or conduct the international webinars. I also congratulate the Department of Political Science, all teachers. They frequently arrange the international and national webinars. I do hope that our participant would reap a sound harvest from the webinars. I firmly believe that this kind of webinars and discussion will be interesting and interactive one. Also, the survey of the webinars and the reciprocal discussion, I do hope would further illumine the minds of the teachers and taught. I wish one success of the webinars. Once again, thanking you all.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much for your welcome address. May I now request to Professor Sanjay K. Bhardwaj, sir, to kindly chair the session. Sir, now it's over to you.
Thank you, Prashant, for this opportunity. Let me thanks for first Bidhan Chandra College for inviting me and giving this opportunity, particularly the Vice Principal, Dr.Ramesh and the head of the department, Devdas De. And but the credit goes to the very bright, very promising scholar, Mr. Prashant Kumar Sharma, who had been organizing number of seminars and doing wonderful job for the college. He is an asset for any institution, any college. I've seen Devantu Manji is also been actively participating. So I congratulate and I appreciate the initiatives taken by the college. The topic is very interesting, very interesting. At least we are at the stage where a number of scholars, academicians, think tanks, they are discussing about the American role in the current contemporary world system, world order. Particularly, there are two very important incidents had happened. One is, of course, we are going through with the global pandemic. And this global pandemic has raised number of questions, particularly while we are looking forward to have the role of neoliberal order, that how much neoliberal order had been successful to provide the health security or the social security or to provide a cohesive or resilient society. Very important things that some of the authoritarian states, they claim that we have been comparatively successful to control this pandemic, particularly Vietnam, Chinese, but I don't think that. But the second point is that while you are analyzing and while you're looking forward about the neoliberal ideology, that the main driver of this neoliberalism the two countries, Americans and the British, they had been during the period of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. They were talking about that. But today, there is also demand for some of the people or some of the countries about the deglobalization. So, and this deglobalization, what do you really feel that the neoliberal ideology had been questioned? This is one point that I would be happy that if Professor David Masson would come out. The second very important aspect is that that Russian-Ukraine war that is going on, and it's very important. What is, I do feel it as a political science or international relations scholar, that the international security system is comparatively or relatively failed in the sense of to provide the security to the innocent people, or that security to Ukraine people, and there are gross human right violation is going on. But there is except that the countries are thinking to expand military organizations, expand NATO, or looking forward to have more military organizations like Quad or like AUKUS, that what the international organization or the countries are they really looking to have a social security or humanitarian security, or by the international institutions, or strengthening, or you can say making more strong international institutions like UN, or thinking about the reforms of the UN that had been dominated by few superpowers. These are the two very important incidents had been taken place in recent past. That is basically talking that where in this contemporary, in these issues, America stands. Of course, power is a relative concept. And there, the ideological power, military power, that is demonstrated in case of the Ukraine and the Russia, and of course economic power that is also demonstrated in the case of China. So that American power being challenged militarily and economically by the rise of China, or by the demonstration of the Russian? That is another question. But of course, the world is also moving towards from unipolar to, it was bipolar, then it has again become unipolar. Now that it is moving towards the multipolarity, and in that, India is also emerging very important actor. In fact, India had been adopting very independent foreign policy that maintained strategic autonomy, and now India is basically looking forward for multi-aligned foreign policy, where India is also member of BRICS, and India is also a member of Quad. So how these and all developments are looking forward, while India and United States had come ever closer. They have developed 4 foundational agreements, and they are coming together. So how Professor David Masson would look forward all these developments in his lecture. So it's a great opportunity for all of us to listen. Professor David Masson, he had written wonderful book, The End of American Century, that was well read by the scholars. I am also teaching foreign policy. I also refer my students to go through his book, and that he has come out with wonderful work that talking about the American ideological power, American governance, American challenges from the multiple sources at the national and international level. So I won't take much time, and I would rather we are here to listen Professor David Masson. So I request Professor David Masson, please go ahead, and we are eagerly want to listen to you. Thank you very much. Now the dice is with you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Bhardwaj and Professor Carr, and also Professor Sharma for that very nice introduction. And thank you for inviting me too. I mean, this is quite a privilege for me to be able to share some of these ideas and discuss them with such a distinguished group of scholars. And, especially Prashant, thank you for organizing all this. I know it's been a lot of work for you to do that. I'm really delighted to be here in Calcutta, even if it's virtual. Because I've never been to the city before. I have visited India twice, sort of rather unusual circumstances, I taught on a floating university called Semester at Sea, which literally sails around the world for a semester and stops at various places, including Chennai. So that was I did that twice in 1988 and 1998. And I was really enjoyed my time there and was enchanted with India. So it's nice to be participating in this with all of you scholars from that country. You've asked me to speak about my book, The End of the American Century. Let me see if we can get started here with the screen sharing. I hope this works okay. I'm gonna have to try this again here. Okay, can you see that okay?
Yeah, we can see it. Yeah, it's quite visible.
Okay, I think I'll do it this way instead of doing the full screen sharing.
Okay.
Because this way I can see you all. So you can see that's okay, right?
Yeah, absolutely fine.
Okay, so and this was my book, The End of the American Century, which was published already 15 years ago. A lot has happened in the US and the world since then, of course, and Professor Bhardwaj was just talking about some of the most recent really kind of cataclysmic events almost. But I think the essential message of the book from when I first wrote it remains true today. And that message, that the overall message of this was that the American century, this post-World War II era of US global leadership and dominance, has ended and is not coming back. And this is because of a whole series of factors, both domestic in the United States and international. So in the United States, the decline that I documented in this book has been in almost every sphere, economic, social, cultural, political, military, and diplomatic. But this decline in the US was also accompanied and intensified by global forces, including the rise of alternative power centers, especially China and the European Union, and the influence of globalization. So this multi-dimensional decline of a dominant world power constitutes what I've called a systemic revolution in global politics. So it affects the whole world, not just the United States. Furthermore, I think that these problems have intensified since 2008, when the book first came out, as America's decline has fostered fear, reaction, racism, and polarization in the United States, which has been capitalized on by demagogues like Donald Trump. Indeed, I believe the US is in more serious jeopardy now than it was when I first started writing the book. So what I would like to do today is to first give you an overview of some of the principal findings and conclusions of the end of the American century, then discuss how those have played out in the years since the book was published, and then reflect on what this means for both the United States and the rest of the world. And afterwards, I would love to hear your thoughts on and reactions to all of this. First, let me start out with an explanation of the title of the book and this talk. So the American century as a term was the title of an influential essay written in 1941 for Life magazine by Henry Luce, the magazine's publisher. as Hitler's armies stormed across Europe, at the time, Luce called on the United States to shoulder world leadership, to come to the defense of our ally Britain in the wake of the Nazi blitzes, and to, quote, promote and encourage and incite so-called democratic principles throughout the world. Such action, Luce said, would help create, quote, create the first great American century. Indeed, in the next several decades, the United States propelled world trade and economic growth. Its science and technology provided the leading edge of innovation and discovery. The country's democratic institutions and educational system served as beacons all over the world. Its popular and consumer culture were envied and mimicked everywhere. And American military prowess was admired and feared by governments and revolutionaries alike. But by the end of the 20th century, and particularly after the tragedy of September 11th, 2001, every aspect of this American predominance began to fade. America's decline was a result of three convergent and interrelated phenomena. First, the deterioration of the US itself, especially in the economic realm, but in many other respects as well. Second, the increasing influence of other global powers. And third, the changed nature of global interactions. The decade-long convergence of all three of these phenomena marks a global shift of historic proportions, and one that defines a much different place in the world for the United States and its citizens. You can get a sense of the scope of my approach from the list of chapters in the book, each of which addresses various aspects of this decline. I use data to illustrate these trends, so the book contains some 30 figures and tables. I will show you some of these in a few areas, but just as examples. You'll have to read the book yourself if you want to see them all and get a sense of all of the data that I elicited for this. In the book, I argued that the central aspects of US decline was economic. I'm not sure I still see this as the most important weakness in the US, but the basic features of the problem persist to this day. The federal government, the state governments, and most households had been living beyond their means for a generation. And the result was unprecedented levels of government, household, mortgage, and consumer debt. US federal government debt was only one aspect of this, but one of the most glaring and troublesome. Between 1980 and 2008, when I wrote the book, federal debt grew from 33% of GDP, of gross domestic product, to almost 70% of GDP, a level many economists considered untenable. So this shows US federal debt as a percent of GDP from 1970 up to 2010. And you see this growth from almost doubling as a percentage of GDP. But since that time, that percentage has grown to over 100%. So this is from 1970, and then you add those last 3 years, 2010, 12, and 16, you see that US federal debt is more than 100% of GDP. So, as I said, a lot of economists sort of thought that 60 or 70% was risky. And that number, over 100%, remains today. That figure is similar today. And government debt alone is only part of the problem. American citizens spend and consume more than they earn, and the United States as a whole consumes more than it produces. This has posed a burden on the rest of the world that is unsustainable in the long run. Furthermore, most Americans have seen no real increase in real wages since the 1970s. While there have been huge increases in both wealth and income for those at the top of the economic pyramid. Poverty and inequality are higher in the US than in most other developed countries. Economic inequality is higher now than it was on the eve of the Great Depression in the United States, and both have been growing in recent decades. So you've probably seen figures like this before. I mean, this gives an example. So if you look at average household incomes of from 1967 to 2006, so this very bottom black line is the poorest fifth of the population. And you see there's been no increase there. The middle fifth, very little increase. The richest fifth, quite a substantial increase, and the richest 5%, a very substantial increase in mean household income. The extreme nature of this issue is evident looking at the very top of the political spectrum, of the economic structure. For example, looking at CEO pay. So the CEO is Chief Executive Officer. So these are the heads of the major corporations in these various countries. And you look at the ratio of CEO pay in these countries as a multiple of average worker pay. So for example, in Japan, CEO pay was about 10 times what average worker pay was. And you see these differences go up here. But then look when you add the US into the formula. So these are the same countries we just saw, Japan through Brazil. So that's Japan through Brazil, but it's just dwarfed by this figure in the United States, where CEO pay is 530 times that of average worker pay. Now, these numbers have kind of gone up and down, but they've always been much, much higher in the United States than any other developed country. And these numbers have been increasing pretty sharply in the last couple of decades. So this is the United States. In terms of economically, for the bulk of the population, there's been very little improvement except for the very wealthy. And of course, this has just led to extreme divergences in wealth and poverty in the United States. The US has also fallen behind other countries in many other areas where we flourished during the American century. So, you know, I have different chapters on various aspects of these declines too. And I can only sort of touch on some examples of these here, but the educational system in the United States, once considered the world's best, now ranks near the bottom among developed countries, at least if you look at averages. And of course, the main reason for that is, and the United States still has some of the best education in the world, but it's only available to a relatively small number of people. So the average level of education in the United States is not very high at all compared to most other, if you look at OECD countries, for example. So educational system now ranks near the bottom among developed countries. Healthcare shows the worst results on average of any major developed country, again, on the average basis. So if you look, for example, at just one statistic, I have lots that I use in my book, but this one is a kind of general measure of overall healthcare in a country, is infant mortality rates. So you'd expect these infant mortality rates to be low in wealthy countries. And of course, in the wealthy countries, it is lower than in poor countries. But in the United States had the highest infant mortality rate of any of these members of OECD. So the US has higher poverty rates, has more violence, greater inequality than almost any other developed country. Our roads, highways, bridges, and dams, most built near the beginning of the American century, are increasingly decrepit and in need of major repairs. Even the country's vaunted political system tarnished by private interests, money, and bitter partisanship, is no longer a model for emulation much of anywhere else in the world. While the US has been on a long slide, both with our domestic health and our international reputation, other countries and regions have been moving ahead and gaining confidence and clout. Professor Bhardwaj mentioned the BRIC countries, and of course, India being part of that. And I have some data in the book, although some of this data is not completely up to date, but I think the trends still hold. But at that time, and even now, China is sort of the world's workshop and has had the fastest sustained economic growth of any country in history. Of course, India is doing pretty well too. This was from middle 2000s, those years. But if you look at average GDP growth rate, you see China, India, in those days, Russia, quite a bit higher than the United States. And while these numbers aren't the same now, the tendency is similar. China still has a higher growth rate. India still has a higher growth rate, for example, much higher growth rate than the United States. Also, the European Union has brought together 27 countries into a peaceful and healthy community, an economic bloc bigger than the US, and with many countries more successful than the US in providing healthcare, education, and welfare to their citizens. Many other countries are increasingly prosperous, confident, and assertive to the point of challenging US dominance in their own parts of the globe. America's global reputation has also suffered. This is a striking turnaround from the heyday of the American century, when all things American, from Marlboro cigarettes to multi-party elections, were admired and coveted in most parts of the world. With the disappearance of US hegemony, all that has changed. The US economy of free market capitalism is no longer the standard or the model, especially now that its weaknesses are so manifest. American-style democracy, so corrupted by money and special interests, is no longer the beacon on the hill. Many foreigners see American individualism and exceptionalism as a weakness rather than a strength, and even a kind of perversion. America's appetites for consumer goods is now becoming clear, has hurt the planet and its people by exhausting its resources and polluting its environment. Global opinion surveys show a majority of people in most countries thinking that the spread of US customs and ideas is bad, and that it would be better if another country rivaled US military power. So these were, the Pew Research Center does these periodic surveys of global public opinion on various issues. But this question was, is the spread of US ideas and customs good or bad? And you can see in almost all countries, a majority thought that it was bad. See countries like France, for example, is perhaps not unexpectedly quite high there, but so Arab and Muslim countries also, these numbers pretty high. India, 54% thinking it was bad. And another table, this may be a little hard to read, but this question was, would it be better if another country rivaled US military power? And the percentage of people saying yes to that question. So in the US, of course, only a quarter said yes, roughly, but almost everywhere else, there was a sense that it would be good if other countries rivaled US military power. In addition, globalization has changed the rules of the game. Labor and capital move more easily around the world, making it more difficult for the US or any government, for that matter, to control economic development. Organizations that span national borders, international and non-governmental organizations, multinational corporations, terrorist groups, are, for good or ill, challenging the power and influence of countries. Catastrophes like climate change and pandemics are global and transnational too, spanning national boundaries and confounding efforts by individual countries to control them. All of this makes global politics more complex and less subject to the influence of single nation states, especially go-it-alone ones, as the US has often been. The decline of the US has potentially revolutionary implications, both in the United States and around the world, though it is the global impact of American decline that leads me to label it as a systemic revolution. But let me first briefly address the remote, though real, I think, possibility of a political revolution inside the United States itself. The intensity and breadth of US decline certainly creates some of the preconditions for revolution. Think about the US situation in light of some of the more prevalent political science and sociological theories of the causes of revolution historically. The growing immiseration of the working class, for example, Marx's theory. The theory of rising expectations that de Tocqueville raised. After a period of growing affluence, people expect more, but the improvements slow down or reverse. Increasing inequality and the growing gap between rich and poor. And Theta Skocpol's theory about states and social revolution. She argued that the weakening and breakdown of state organizations was a condition that could lead to revolution. All of these things are happening now in various degrees, and these processes seem unlikely to reverse anytime soon. And the US came dangerously close to such a situation last January 6th, when Donald Trump and his supporters effectively tried to overthrow the US government. Whether or not there is an internal revolution in the US, the global changes caused by America's decline by themselves constitute a transformation on this scale of systemic revolution. The US has dominated the globe for at least half a century, and one could argue even longer. The country had the biggest economy, the wealthiest citizenry, the strongest military, the most admired political system. Its language and its money were considered the global standards. Its popular culture, fads, trademarks, and consumer goods were coveted and mimicked around the globe. No country in history has so dominated the world as the US did during the American century. So these are some of the themes from my book from 15 years ago. In the discussion, I'll look forward to hearing whether some of you think these predictions are prescient or simply alarmist. But let me now address where I think we are right now in a very different environment than when I first wrote the book. In some respects, I think there are some signs of hope. In others, the situation seems to have deteriorated. Thinking back now on the major developments since 2008 makes my head spin. The financial collapse in the US, the election 2 times of Barack Obama, the bizarre and frightening presidency of Donald Trump and his encouragement of white supremacist groups, the January 6th coup attempt, the murder of George Floyd, and the US reckoning with and conflict over our history of slavery and racism, the growing realization of the immediacy of climate change, the COVID pandemic, the frightening explosion of gun violence and mass murders in the United States, the continuing growth of wealth and income inequality in the US, and the disturbing persistence of support for Donald Trump, and what that says about America's commitment to democracy, constitutionalism, and the rule of law. And then, of course, in this last year or two, we've had this whole catastrophe with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and global responses to that. So any of these phenomena would pose a serious challenge to any government. In the US, it has led to such political divisions that our federal government practically cannot function anymore. With a narrowly divided Congress and the Republicans unanimously opposing virtually any initiative from the Democrats, serious legislation is practically impossible. This itself poses two problems. The federal government is hobbled or paralyzed trying to deal with life-threatening problems like climate change and the pandemic, and citizens are increasingly frustrated and alienated from government, providing the seedbed for radicalism on both left and right. On the other hand, there are some hopeful signs that Americans are beginning to address and remedy some of the major problems, the many problems that led to the country's decline. For example, the 2016 election of Donald Trump, a blatant misogynist, sparked a huge women's march in Washington, an explosion of the Me Too movement, and a reckoning with the prevalence of sexual violence and sexual discrimination in the US, and a rapid growth of women entering politics and leadership positions in every corner of American society, including, by the way, my own daughter, a mother of three who was animated because of that to run for elected office in her home city and won, and now she's running for the state legislature. Similarly, the tragic and horrific murder of George Floyd and many others stimulated the Black Lives Matter movement, marches and demonstrations across the country for racial equity, and a newfound commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusivity in every type of institution across the country. Even our own sense of our history and identity has been shaken with publications like the 1619 Project, which highlighted the central role of slavery and institutionalized racism in the country's founding and development. We are now recognizing how much systemic racism contributes to the overall social and economic inequality in the United States. In the last chapter of the American century, the end of the American century, I laid out what I thought were the best case and worst case scenarios for the future of the United States. In the very worst case scenario, I worried about another major terrorist attack on the US, similar to September 11th, but perhaps even deadlier, for example, with a nuclear device. And I wrote about the potential aftermath of such a tragedy. So I wrote, when people are frightened or insecure, they are more concerned about order and security than about human rights and freedom. There was already a worrisome strain of authoritarianism in the American political culture, and this was revealed in the aftermath of September 11th. In the fear and rage following the collapse of the Twin Towers, Americans accepted, almost without blinking, government restrictions on their movement, activities, and privacy, and even on the bedrock democratic principles of habeas corpus. The US Congress passed, almost without debate, the US Patriot Act, with its questionable limits on civil rights and a war authorization bill that gave the president powers as commander-in-chief that were almost unlimited in scope and in time. The mass media meekly accepted the administration's assertions about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and its justifications for the war. Academics were afraid to speak out. Another terrorist attack in combination with imminent economic collapse would almost surely lead to an even stronger assertion of an executive authority. And who would be there to oppose this? A beleaguered government in a crisis of such magnitude might even be tempted to suspend the Constitution or to invoke martial law. The long US experiment with democracy would be at an end. So that's what I wrote in 2008. So far, thankfully, that terrifying scenario of a large-scale terrorist attack has not come about. But other catastrophes like the COVID pandemic and racially based murders have fostered most of the consequences I outlined there. And we came very close to that political crisis last year when apparently President Trump contemplated both a suspension of the Constitution and the invocation of martial law in order to prevent his having to leave office. And there is a not insignificant chance that this psychopath will return to office, inflaming almost all the problems that bedevil the United States. In my best case scenario, at the end of the book, I suggested that this would have to begin with new political leadership. I wrote that when George W. Bush was president. And at the time, before Donald Trump, I thought he had done more to accelerate US decline than any post-war president. The election of Barack Obama was an enormously hopeful and helpful step in moving away from that decline. Obama did much to mend America's fractured relationship with the rest of the world and to begin mending some of the torn social fabric in the country. For example, with the Affordable Care Act, extending health care to millions of poor Americans. The fact that Obama was re-elected showed that American society was beginning to move past its racist heritage and ideas of white supremacy. Unfortunately, the election of Donald Trump demonstrated that racism was still alive in the United States, and for 4 years he fanned the flames of racism, white supremacy, and division. But the principal element of the optimistic scenario was an acceptance and adjustment by Americans and the US leadership to the country's diminished status after the American century, both domestically and internationally. This would require both enlightened leadership in the United States and a public willing to adjust to our new position in the world. This is particularly urgent precisely because the United States is in decline. As historians like Paul Kennedy and Neil Ferguson have pointed out, periods of major power decline are inherently unstable and dangerous for the world. Thus, it is all the more imperative now, for the world's sake, that the United States have at its helm a leader who recognizes and accepts a more limited global role for the United States and is willing to engage other countries from a position of equality rather than domination, and with the goal of cooperation rather than imposition. A quarter century ago, in the rise and fall of the great powers, Paul Kennedy suggested that the United States would, quote, a long time in the future, eventually decline to its natural share of the world's wealth and power. Given the country's large size, population, and natural resources, this should be, as he put it, perhaps 16 or 18% of the world's wealth and power, rather than the 30 to 40% held by the US from the beginning to the end of the American century. The US is now moving toward that more natural position in the world. It will be a substantial test of US leadership to manage that decline. Accepting a reduced and more cooperative role in the world will require wisdom and statesmanship, but will actually find considerable support among US citizens. Recent polls suggest that only about 8% of Americans believe that the United States should be the preeminent world leader in solving international problems. Over 70% are opposed to the US playing the role of world policeman. The overwhelming majority believe that the US should do its share in efforts to solve international problems together with other countries. And most Americans, for example, believe in that the problems of climate change and believe that it's man-made and deserves attention, even though it's very difficult to get our Congress to do anything about it at this point. Other surveys by the Pew Global Attitudes Project have shown a similar orientation by Americans for the country to play a less dominant and more cooperative role in world affairs. In the best case scenario, a less militaristic, unilateralist, and interventionist international role for the United States will allow a reduction in US military spending, which would free up substantial resources to begin repairing the badly damaged physical and social infrastructure of the United States. More attention to education, for example, would go a long way toward solving many of the country's domestic problems. Better schools and broader access to quality education would help reduce the shameful poverty, inequality, and systemic racism in the United States. It would stimulate political participation, including voting, especially from minorities. Broader political participation would serve to reinvigorate the political system and relieve the stranglehold of money on politics. Even more importantly, perhaps, better education would make American citizens more informed about their own country and its problems, and about other countries and their problems. It could make Americans more critical and intellectually discriminating and less susceptible to propaganda, mendacity, and fundamentalism of all stripes. The optimistic scenario, however, also requires a kind of psychological shift by American citizens. In 1941, Americans were not as affluent, confident, and self-assured as they are now. Indeed, the appeals of both Luce and Franklin Roosevelt in the 40s were for Americans to become more assertive and active in world affairs. But over the course of the American century, the pendulum swung far in the opposite direction, to the point where many Americans and even their president assumed a kind of divine mission for the US to lead, guide, and even govern the world. American exceptionalism morphed into excesses of individualism, ethnocentrism, arrogance, and a sense of entitlement. At the beginning of the American century, the preeminent American theologian Reinhold Niebuhr cautioned against such excessive self-confidence and worried that US idealism could generate into fanaticism. What the world needs now, even more than in Niebuhr's time, is an America willing to recognize its own shortcomings, to listen to the voices and ideals of others, and to adjust its own interests and needs to those of the broader global community. As Niebuhr argued, open-mindedness is not, quote, a virtue of people who don't believe anything. It is a virtue of people who know that their beliefs are not absolutely true. Now, more than ever, the world needs a more humble America. So, thank you. That's my presentation, and I welcome your responses.
Thank you, Professor David, for wonderful presentation and giving a historical perspective, how, or you can say the retrospective of analysis of the American policy, that where the America is heading towards, and what the role, in fact, the debate in America regarding the role in for international peace, for democracy, for human rights, and the other areas that India, where the US had been working, particularly in improving quality education, that could be helpful for the to remove the poverty and inequality and all that, and the different presidential candidates, how they have been moved ahead. And particularly, we also talked about the pluralistic nature of the American society that had been in the last few years had been challenged by different policy or different political interventions by the American leaders. So it's really wonderful presentation. It's very insightful lecture you had discussed about the America. You had you are having number of questions, very interesting questions I'm having with that. I think let me go one by one, or shall I read all the questions together? Shall I go? But how do you want to go, Professor David? Or you can read it. You can go ahead. Up to you.
I can see them too in the chat. Do you want me to just respond to them?
Yeah.
From the chat?
Yeah.
Okay, so the question about American Taiwan policy. Will the USA really come in defense of Taipei if Taiwan faces any aggression from mainland China?
Yeah, Kushal Bhattacharya has asked, yes.
That's a very good question. And I don't exactly know how to answer that. It seems like, I mean, there's a couple of precedents, of course, or precedents that would be relevant to it. One of them is the incorporation of Hong Kong. So, you know, Hong Kong and Taiwan in some ways had a kind of similar status. They were parts of China that had been alienated but would come back eventually. And, you know, China promised to keep some of the autonomy available in Hong Kong after it was reincorporated into China, and it really hasn't done that. And there wasn't much the US could do about it, I would say, or anybody else. So Taiwan, I think, I would imagine, although I think some of you all will be more expert on this than I am, but I would imagine that China will eventually attempt to incorporate Taiwan. And the US treaty obligations suggest assist. But the other precedent, of course, is what's happened in Ukraine. And the US really, as Professor Bhardwaj mentioned earlier, the international community has not been very effective at dealing with this, I don't think. But I think a Chinese occupation of Taiwan would be similar in that there wouldn't be much that the United States could do, I wouldn't think, short of starting a major war. And this was the same issue that has kept the United States from taking any specifically military action, I think, in Ukraine as well. So it's a very good question and a very important one. And I suspect that is going to be something, a crisis in the future. But I'd like to hear what some of you all think about that, because some of you are or spend more time looking at this issue than I have.
Yeah, we will give the opportunity to others. I think you have second question, Professor, about the. This is Samendra Mohan Biswas has asked question.
Okay, this Biswas, the arrival of third world in the changing scenario. Also, do you really see the end of U.S. hegemony as far as politics, military concerned in a changed world, or can the world do without the U.S.? Yes, I think the third world, and I alluded to, I talk about this in the book. I didn't say so much about it in my lecture, but there are the third world. Many countries in the third world are asserting themselves and becoming more demonstrative and more autonomous, I would say, in international politics. So countries like Brazil, for example, or South Africa, India, I don't think we can properly consider India third world, but there are countries that are becoming more assertive and less willing to take the American lead or to follow American initiatives. So in terms of, I do think there's a difference between a loss of hegemony and a loss of influence. So my major argument has been that what is diminishing is US hegemony, that the United States is no longer able to dictate global politics like it did for almost the entirety of the American century. That doesn't mean the United States isn't going to play a big role. I mean, we still are the wealthiest country in the world. We still are the most powerful country in the world. But so the U.S. will still be playing a role. It just won't have that hegemonic influence that it did during the American century. And I think we're already seeing this, with the European Union taking somewhat more autonomous foreign policy actions, and other countries too. Okay, so would you like me to sort of answer all these questions and then we can come back to the discussion, or?
No, I think yeah, you can continue about the next question is about the US hegemony, and it's a traditional ally, Europe to cut down their reliance on Washington. So
I would say absolutely yes. And
very interesting in the present context.
Yeah. So, and you've seen this, I've got another book I've written, it's a history of Europe since the French Revolution. It's just a short textbook, and I'm just now doing revising that book for a 5th edition. By the way, that book was also published in India. So this is the Orient Black Swan publisher in India published this book. This is it's a short history of Europe, but I'm now working on the 5th edition of the American version of that book, and so it's primarily it's focused on Europe, of course, but in that I mentioned there's been some very emphatic statements by the leaders of Germany and France and other countries, basically saying that they're now going to make their own decisions about international politics and will not be so compliant with US views. And some pretty emphatic, direct statements along those lines. So, and in fact, it's one of the last lines in that I use in that European history book is that Europe has sort of grown up now since World War II. It came out of World War II thoroughly dependent on the United States, and its own economic and social successes have led it to a position where it doesn't really need to depend on the United States anymore, and is a kind of self-sufficient power on its own merits. So I would say absolutely, the Europeans are increasingly less likely to take dictates from the United States.
The next question is very interesting. Particularly, it applies more on South Asia. That the American economic policy regarding China in countering China's debt trap policy. And let me add one more question here. That the Chinese are coming with huge infrastructure in South Asian countries, particularly the one country, island country in Indian Ocean, Sri Lanka has come under that trap. And, they are also investing a lot in Pakistan, and Pakistan's economic condition is also not very good. So how do you find that this the Chinese, they are trying to dominate in Indian Ocean region, and they are also trying to have access to these countries' economic market. So how the Americans are coming with this to counterbalance or to have these countries in that trap?
I don't think the United States is responding very well to this. One of the, there's a whole chapter in the End of the American Century book is about China. And I predicted then that China was increasingly going to be playing a bigger role and challenging the American role. And I think this has become even more evident. I mean, the Chinese leadership has basically said this, that they want to expand their role globally, and they've been investing heavily in many countries, third world countries, and especially. I'm always amazed when I travel, seeing how many Chinese projects there are in various far-flung places. And you mentioned the China's debt trap policy, and it's a very interesting way to put that, because I think, ironically, I think there's also a kind of debt trap policy that China's been using with regard to the United States, in that an awful lot of the US debt is actually controlled by China. So, this, we have a kind of oddly dependent role economically on China, even the United States does. So, you ask about how's American economic policy responding to this. I think it's pretty far down on the priority list at the moment. So I don't think the U.S. has really confronted it properly enough.
Yeah.
So
that great.
Yeah.
No, great. That I think they are also looking that the next century would be the Beijing's or Chinese century, in fact. But in between, I would also like to, if we have with us from a professor from Ukraine, Professor Anatoly. He's a professor of political science from Ukraine. Do you want to add something, Professor, regarding the recent developments is taking place and the role of China, how they are coming out with this, the crisis, what happening in Ukraine and the other part?
Yeah, probably yes. I'm really impressed with the presentation made with the Professor David Mason. It's really nice to hear you, Professor. And the very topic or the very definition of decay or the end of century or whatever remind me the prognosed decay of the Europe in the beginning of 20th century and then other decays. Well, it is very important to reconsider the role of the United States is playing and plays in the world affairs, in the domestic affairs, some crises which are really correctly attributed to the United States domestic and foreign policy, and especially a pretty specific color of politics performed with Donald Trump. And there are a lot of questions, including the international scene for the United States-China competition, and for sure the drifts of any bigger powers and greater powers in world affairs, including China, Russia, so suggested or supposed alliances. Regarding the China itself, I would say that sure, I do agree with Professor that China goes to be much more influential very soon, and China tries and attempts at doing that very successfully, especially in the economic area, exploring soft and smart powers or instruments. I do agree with that, but in the same time, regarding the role of China in the Ukrainian situation, I mean, Russian war against Ukraine, it's a really complicated issue because China tries to, on the one hand, to support Russia, on the other hand, to demonstrate its responsibility as a global actor, as a reliable member of the United Nations, so on and so forth. And there are a lot of contradictory traits, including the last novelty that in China, pupils at schools are taught about that Russia, Russia introducing the kind of legitimate interference in Ukrainian affairs, and that is a good case. Maybe China is preoccupied with the Taiwan situation and tries to pave the way for the further intervention into Taiwan. Probably there are a lot of different reasons. But in the same time, let me generally speculate on the ideas of the remodeling the world order, because it's obvious that after 2014 and 2022, the world order will never be the same as it was before. I think that we have the ideas of the unipolarity, multipolarity, and in the same time we have the worst case scenario, return to Hobbesian order, so the anarchy and the war of each against other. So all the scenarios are available, all of them are on the table to discuss by scholars from the United States, from India, China, Ukraine, European countries, whatever. And I think that we are going to enter the more complicated, more contradictory world, and therefore the regional alliances would play the growing role, not only just global actors, because they are not sufficient enough in sense of their strengths, economic capacity, informational influence, whatever attractiveness. So far, my opinion is that this is time of building up the regional, if not blocks, then alliances, and to reconsider critically the previous structure of world affairs and international scene, including the bigger issue of the ineffectiveness of the United Nations as the only global organizations in charge of preventing war and conflicts. So far, I guess that decay of America, it does not automatically means the betterment of our world, making it secure, safer, and whatever else. And therefore, from Indian point of view, American point of view, Ukrainian, European, Asian, or African, we have to look for the solutions which is more or less suitable and acceptable for the humanities. Because in my opinion, it's not about the state. Speaking about the realism or neorealism approaches, I see that states, especially bigger states, much stronger states, remain the key actors in the world affair. But what about the mankind? We see that step by step we have a more challenging situation for the survival of all mankind. And so far, it's not enough to consider the competition and the interplay of the global actors, but to see what can the mankind and the respective international organizations, regional and global, to deal with the new agenda of our survival and our prospect. And from that point of view, we can say yes or no towards the decay of America, the end of the American century. I remember just for joking, professional joking, that Mr. Fukuyama told us about the end of history, and then later he reconsidered his too fast assumption. So, in my opinion, America does not do progress with regard to decay. America tries to reconsider, to reorganize itself alongside with its allies. By the way, thank you for your reference towards Ukrainian situation. When we, just in the last sentence, when we are dealing about Rammstein meeting and the new coalition, anti-Russian or anti-Putin coalition, you could see that there are a lot of new possibilities of reordering, reconsidering the global international agenda and the international cooperation. So far, we are really living in amazing time, while this time is really open to new threats and to new risks and challenges. But still, thank you very much for your provocative and very going depth analysis, plus great questions issued here by you participants. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, Professor Anatoly, for raising particularly about the humanitarian concerns and all that, and particularly indicating the role of regional organizations, regional organizations. But I'm wondering that regional organizations, regional institutions are rather moving towards the military organizations or militarizations instead of economic organizations or developmental organizations. I think the world is moving towards that. Do you want to respond right now, Professor David, or like I can invite the next one more question Professor Madhuri wants to ask?
Yeah, thank you. Am I audible?
Yeah, shall I take one question, Professor David?
That's fine.
Okay, Dr. Madhuri, you can go ahead, please.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much, Professor David. I think you had everything on your platter. I have going to gather a lot of inputs from your presentation. Thanks a lot. Now, my query basically is regarding the Arctic policy. You know, this whole Russia's aggression on Ukraine, I think two things really have stood out. One is the energy consideration and where the world is going, and the other is a food security crisis. Now, my take is that sooner or later, it's the whole there'll be a lot of power politics at play in the Arctic because of what Russia has, the kind of oil reserves that Russia has in the Arctic. So does the United States have any kind of a plan or some kind of a thing in mind to match up to Russia as far as energy considerations in the Arctic is concerned? Because I know in March 2022, India has kind of gone in for an Arctic policy. It is in collaboration, it is pertaining to sustainable development as far as the Arctic is concerned. So I just want to know, I know America is far superior to Russia in so many fields, we know that. But as far as, the energy part is concerned, the oil crisis is concerned, I think Arctic will give vent to power ambitions in the future. So I wanted to please respond to that.
Yeah, Professor David.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And, one thing that's sort of interesting is that if you look at the globe from from the north, sort of looking down on the Arctic Ocean, Russia is going to be the only non-NATO country bordering the Arctic Ocean if once Finland and Sweden join NATO as well. So it's an important one, as you point out, Professor Bhardwaj, that because of the oil resources there. I think there's a potential silver lining in the energy crisis that's been sparked by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that is an acceleration of the movement toward renewable resources, renewable energy. Already the European Union is already committed I think, to reach, basically to go virtually all renewable energy within about 20 or 30 years. And the United States is a little bit behind the curve on this development, but I think this, the whole realization of how dependent we are on Russian oil and natural gas may stimulate some of these movements toward things that we should have been doing anyway because of climate change issues. But that's sort of the longer run. I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen in the short run. I agree with you completely, Professor, that this is, we've got these two big issues, both food and energy, that have been provoked by Ukraine, which has been considered the breadbasket of Europe for much of this century. So these are, and I also agree with you that with Professor Kruglashoff, that this is going to be sort of earth-shaking in terms of how it's going to affect international politics. Just this one incident. I mean, it's more than an incident at this point. It's a full-blown catastrophe, but it's shaking up the whole notion of how we deal with international politics. The United Nations has been totally impotent in the face of this thing, and raises questions about whether we have to rethink the formation of a global order, much as we did right after World War II. I mean, this whole American century was born at the time of this kind of neoliberal global order that fostered the United Nations and NATO and the International Monetary Fund, and the whole structure of global politics was created then in the 40s. And I think we're at a inflection point now where we're going to be reconsidering all those things. It took a world war to do it last time. Let's hope that it doesn't have a world war won't be necessary to create such a reconfiguration now.
Yeah, thank you. I think the number of other questions like Puneet Pandey, Fatima, and Samrinda Mohan, they have also raised the question related to the energy security and like the food security, because there are common concern, and they're, of course, they are afraid about the decline. The US is declining as a state actor to ensure the international order, protect the international order. So they are looking at how if US fails to take the responsibility, whether the human security or the citizens would come under attack. I think this is Puneet Pandey is indicating that.
Right. So I mean, the decline, it's both, right? And these two things reinforce each other. So my book really spends, most of the chapters in my book are about the social and economic decline in the United States. And you ask if this is failing to ensure the human security of its citizens, and I would say yes, it is failing. And we see this with the growing inequality, the lack of really any improvement in standard of living for most Americans, the inadequate attention to healthcare and education. If those are considered broadly as human security, which I think they are, then we're not doing so well in those categories. Plus, even the basic notion of protection of life is becoming a problem here with the proliferation of guns. What did I see? The number of guns, I just saw a figure on this, but there's something like, if I'm not mistaken, 400 million guns in households in the United States. It's twice as many as there are people. And both the Congress and the courts have been increasingly deregulating access to firearms. So I think we're just going to see more and more of these kind of mass murders that have coming to afflict us. So that, in terms of basic human security, we're not doing very well there either. So I would say it's both. And then,
I think we are end with the session. We do not have, there are number of questions you addressed. So do you want to say something else, or shall I conclude the things, Professor David?
Let me see here.
The questions you have already addressed, all the questions. The last.
Probably okay. I mean, some of these questions we've sort of talked about already. I think about.
Yes, that's why I was talking. That one is again this Puneet Pandey is raising, but I think that you have already addressed this question.
Yeah, and I do think in terms of the last question about non-state actors.
Yeah, you can please.
I think they will probably play a more important role, but I think also there needs to be some different kinds of interstate actors. So we talked a little bit already about new regional alliances and maybe some reconfiguration of global organizations like the United Nations. So this is all part of that systemic revolution I referred to, that sort of everything seems to be sort of up for grabs now, for better or for worse.
So I think it is done. Shall I? So thank you. I think thank you very much, Professor David, for this wonderful deliberation and very analytical, very insightful lecture that you, and we had very rich questions, and you have categorically with all the questions you have answered. So thank you very much. And again, the debate is always there about the human security, or like it should be the state centric, or it should be the individual centric, how we should go. There should be freedom from want, or there should be freedom from fear. That debates is still there, particularly in this context, that how we can ensure the social security, how we can ensure the state security. The two incidents are there. But what I draw, in fact, keeping your lecture into mind, and about that the neo-realist ideology is still overloaded over the neoliberal ideology. In fact, that the neo-realism, the world is still moving towards the arms race, towards the nuclearization, and particularly if I'm looking and I'm just analyzing about the role of China, and that they have the Chinese, they have become either revisionist or they have become expansionist, and there are a lot of new issues are arising in South China Sea, in Taiwan, in some of the smaller countries, developing countries. They are trapped under that, and there are a number of issues are arising in all over the world, and that further it is pushed towards the issue of food security and all that. So I do find that in this in the debates of to ensure the energy security, or to ensure the food security, and or to ensure the state security, which direction the world would move, number one, and how the Americans, because the Americans, they have been very dominant actor. They had after the Second World War, how they will move ahead while there is debate of American first, how much they would take the responsibility to peace and stability all over the world, where they have withdrawn from Afghanistan, where they are wherever they are going, there are a lot of other issues are arising. How the Americans would come out from the crisis that the Ukrainian are facing today. So these are the still unanswered questions, and now the America, they are looking forward to making further military alliance in Indo-Pacific region. Particularly, I'm indicating about Quad, or I'm indicating about AUKUS. So there are a lot of things are still going on all over the world. Let's see that is it the really decline of American century, or it is just the world is moving towards multipolarity, or it is moving further to a bipolarity with the rise of China, or if the things would go ahead, the US will remain as sole superpower in the world, keeping the present crisis all over the world. So these are the very important issues still we are looking forward. We will definitely have further. We'll be happy to listen, Professor David. The number of questions will be unfolded in near future. So let's see how things would go ahead. So I thank you, Dr. Prashant Kumar Sharma, for giving this opportunity. I also thank you, Professor Anatoly, for your very timely intervention for this in this seminar. And definitely we have been enriched by Professor David Masson for his wonderful deliberation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure meeting you all and discussing these issues. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much, sir, for making this program academically more engaging and thought-provoking. As the chair, so thank you very much for taking out time from a busy schedule to chair this webinar. We felt deeply honored with your participation. We sincerely extend our heartiest thanks and gratitude to Professor David S. Masson, sir, for accepting our invitation and for enriching us on such a hard-hitting and provocative theme entitled "The End of American Century." Thank you very much, sir, for casting light on several interrelated aspects that indicate to the beginning of a new epoch where fundamental transformation in global scenario is transpiring. That was quite explicit in your lecture. We look forward to more opportunities to hear your thoughts and ideas. Thank you very much, sir. We also thank you to Professor Anatoly Kruglasov, sir, and Professor Madhuri Sukhija, University of Delhi, for sharing their views in our program. We extend our profound thanks and gratitude to our Vice Principal, Sir Dr. Ramesh, the head of the institution, for granting his approval and providing his all-round perennial support and encouragement for organizing this event. Thank you very much, sir. Now we would like to thank to the President of the governing body of our institution, Dr. Sudipto Roy, and all the members of the governing body for their constant moral support to our program. Our thanks also go to Dr. Subhajit Ghosh, coordinator at our institution, and to Professor Sadhunath Kundu, internal quality coordinator of the Internal Quality Assurance Cell, and Professor Praveer Kanti Basu, Secretary Teachers Council, for their continued moral support. Our sincere thanks also go to Professor Devdas De, head at the Department of Political Science, for his unwavering support and guidance. We would also like to thank Dr. Abdul Khalik, an assistant professor at the Department of Physics, for providing all the technical assistance we require. Our vote of thanks also go to Professor Dev Tanumazi, Professor Kamal Roy, and Professor Ananta Mitra, all at the Department of Political Science, for their continued support in organizing this webinar. We extend our heartiest thanks to all the teaching and non-teaching staff of our institution for their moral support. A special thanks goes to all the students of the Department of Political Science for their enthusiastic participation. Last but not the least, our sincere thanks go to all the respected participants present here for their active participation and for making this event a huge success. Thank you very much. We look forward to see you all again in our forthcoming programs. Wishing you all the best and have a wonderful time ahead. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Namaskar. Bye-bye all.
Thank you.
Professor
Thank
Dev.
you, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank you
sir.
all.
Take care.